At 2:14 in the afternoon on October 2nd, 1992, 341 military police officers walk into Pavilion 9 of the Carandiru prison in Sao Paulo. Inside are more than 2,000 men. There has been a riot. It began with a fight after a game of football. But there are no hostages. No one has tried to escape. The prisoners control the cell block and nothing else. What happens next takes about 20 minutes. The police move floor by floor. 15 dead on the first, 78 on the second. The shooting is so close that investigators will later recover 515 bullets from inside the bodies. Many of the dead are found with their hands raised in front of their faces. When it is over, 111 prisoners are dead. Not one officer has been killed. No one will go to prison for it. But in the cell blocks that survived, a few men had stopped asking how to survive the system. They had started asking how to run it. This is the story of how that question was answered. It begins in a punishment cell in the interior of Sao Paulo with 8 prisoners and a football team. And it ends with the most powerful criminal organization in the Southern Hemisphere. It is a network that moves cocaine through the busiest port in Latin America, launders billions through gas stations and financial funds on Sao Paulo's wealthiest avenue, and gives orders in 24 countries. A network that, in May 2026, the government of the United States formally labeled a terrorist organization alongside the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. It is called the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the first command of the capital, the PCC. To understand it, you have to understand the man who runs it, a boy who was orphaned at 9, who sniffed glue on the streets of Sao Paulo, who is now sealed inside a federal isolation cell where, for years, he has not seen the sun. And you have to understand a promise the organization made to itself, written into its founding charter, about the dead of Carandiru. The question is not how the PCC became violent. Brazil has never lacked violence. The question is how it became organized, how a few men in a cell built something the state could not kill, and how, every time the state tried, it made the thing stronger. To understand what happened in those cell blocks, you have to understand what a Brazilian prison was in the early 1990s. Carandiru was the largest prison in Latin America, built for a fraction of the men crammed inside it, ruled by violence, abandoned by the state that filled it. There was no rehabilitation. There was barely order. A prisoner survived by attaching himself to whoever was strongest in his cell block, and he paid for that protection in whatever the strong demanded. This is the soil, a system that warehoused the poor, brutalized them, and then acted surprised when they organized. And there is one detail that frames everything that follows. The man who ran Carandiru on the day of the massacre, a director named Jose Ismael Pedrosa, was later transferred to the very prison where the PCC was about to be born. Years later, the faction would have him killed. The line between the massacre and the organization it produced was not a metaphor. It was a man. To break the worst prisoners in the state of Sao Paulo, the system sent them to one place, a maximum punishment unit in the city of Taubaté, in the interior, that the inmates called the Piranhao, the big piranha. There were no sheets, no sun, beatings as routine. The law there, one of the survivors would later write, was the iron pipe. On August 31st, 1993, 8 of those men were on the yard for a prison football championship. Their team carried a name. They had written it on their shirts. Primero Comando de Capital. That day, the founding was sealed in blood. 2 rival inmates were killed in the middle of the yard, one strangled, one beaten to death. And then, his hands still red, the leader the others called Galeao gathered everyone to the center of the court and declared the faction born. They would fight, he said, the corrupt and the oppressors of the prison system. They wrote a statute, 16 articles, a motto, peace, justice, and liberty. And buried in the document was Article 13, a vow that they would stay united so that there would never again be a massacre like the one at the Casa de Detenção on the 2nd of October, 1992, where 111 prisoners were cowardly murdered. A massacre, the article read, that would never be forgotten. A criminal organization had just written the dead of Carandiru into its constitution. The men gave themselves a number, 15, 3, 3, the positions of the letters P, C, and C in the alphabet. They took the yin and yang as their symbol, the balance of good and evil. And they preached something that had never been offered to a Brazilian prisoner before: you will not be exploited anymore. Brother does not kill brother. Brother does not exploit brother. If someone moves against you, they move against all of us. It sounded like a labor union. That was the point. And the structure underneath the slogan did not come from nowhere. In the same Sao Paulo prisons in those years sat 2 Italians with ties to the Camorra, and the men around them absorbed something the Brazilian underworld had never had: a code of conduct, monthly dues, a fund to support the families of prisoners and pay their lawyers, money that was not spent but reinvested. A faction of the enraged was quietly becoming a faction with a balance sheet. The state's response was to break them apart, to scatter the founders across different prisons, far from each other. It was the worst decision it could have made. Each man carried the idea into a new cell block, each one recruited. The thing the state was trying to bury, it was planting. And what grew in the dark had a motto the guards would soon hear chanted through the bars: peace, justice, and liberty. For years, almost no one outside the prison system knew the PCC existed. The state preferred it that way. In May of 1997, a police reporter named Josmar Josino burst into his newsroom in central Sao Paulo, holding a crumpled sheet of paper, shouting that he had it, the statute itself, smuggled out of the prison and into his hands. The next morning's front page announced that a crime party was shaking the prisons. And Sao Paulo's own penitentiary secretary went before the cameras and said it plainly: all of this is mere fiction. In Sao Paulo, he said, there is no organized crime. It was not fiction. It was waiting. On a Sunday afternoon, the 18th of February, 2001, a prison visiting day chosen so that relatives would be inside, the PCC answered. Within 90 minutes, 10 prisons rose at once. By the end, 29. Around 28,000 inmates were in revolt, in coordination, across an entire state. Coordination is the part that matters. It was run by one man, a leader they called Sombra, Shadow, and he ran it from inside his own cell with a smuggled mobile phone. That was the discovery that should have terrified the country. The PCC's most powerful weapon was not a gun. It was a telephone. A man behind bars could now command thousands of men beyond them, in real time, in minutes. After 2001, the state could no longer pretend, and 5 months later, Sombra was found hanged in his cell. Into the vacuum stepped a prisoner who had been there since the beginning, present in the Pavilion in 1993, though not among the 8 on the yard. His name was Marcos Williams Herbis Camacho, the son of a Bolivian father, orphaned at 9, a glue-sniffing street kid who became a bank robber, and then something stranger, a reader. The men called him Marcola. By 2002, he had won the faction's internal war, the war between the ones who wanted to bomb public buildings and the ones who wanted to build an empire. Marcola wanted the empire. He turned the Brotherhood into a corporation. He gave it a hierarchy of councils they called sintonias, frequencies, with a final council that held the last word. He gave it monthly dues, a legal department of lawyers who carried messages between prisons, an internal court that judged its own and sentenced them to death. He gave it discipline. Picture him in those years. A man in a cell the size of a bathroom who has not breathed a free day's air since the 90s. He reads more than most men do in freedom. Sun Tzu is the name people attach to him, though no one has ever proven the list. What he understands, sitting there, is something the men with guns out on the street do not. He does not need a weapon in his hand. He needs the telephone to ring. Every brother out there owes the party. Every brother out there will answer. The cell is not where his power ends. It is where it begins. And so, from inside one, with a phone, he prepared to do to a city of 20 million people what Sombra had done to the prisons. On the 11th of May, 2006, the prison administration of Sao Paulo ordered the transfer of 765 inmates to a maximum security penitentiary far to the west. Among them, the leadership. Among them, Marcola. The faction had been planning something for the Mother's Day weekend. The transfer was meant to decapitate the plan. Instead, it lit the fuse. From inside the cells, by phone, the PCC issued what it called a salve geral, a general call to arms. And for the first time in its history, the violence left the prisons and walked into the streets. It begins on the night of Friday, May 12th. Around 8 in the evening, gunmen in about 15 cars attack a police station. An officer is shot dead near his home. Before midnight, 19 separate attacks. Saturday, it grows. Police stations, courthouses, fire stations, and bank branches were hit with grenades, homemade bombs, and machine guns. The commander of the military police says it on camera. He says, "We are at war. Sunday, Mother's Day, is the peak." More than 100 attacks in a single day. Buses pulled over, passengers ordered off, and set on fire. By the end, around 90 buses burned. Rebellions inside 71 of the state's prisons. 59 agents of the state, police, and prison guards were killed by the faction. And then comes Monday, and the most frightening part of all. Because on Monday, nobody had to attack anything. The city did it to itself. A third of the bus fleet never left the garages. Shops pulled down their shutters. Schools and universities closed. Workers were sent home before dark. Rumors of a curfew emptied the neighborhoods. The traffic jams hit 200 kilometers, a record. The largest city in the hemisphere, one of the largest on Earth, went quiet and went dark. Not because of what the PCC had done, but because of what everyone now understood it could do. Think about what that silence actually was. 11 million people in the city, and many of them spent that Monday doing the same small thing, telephoning a relative to ask whether it was safe to go outside, and deciding that it was not. No one had declared a curfew. The fear did the work the gunman did not have to. A man in a concrete cell had reached out with a telephone and stopped a megacity. Here the story turns, and it turns into something worse. Because the killing did not stop when the PCC's attack stopped. It changed direction. In the days that followed, men in hoods and unmarked cars moved through the poor neighborhoods on the edges of Sao Paulo and the coast, and they began to shoot. Not gang leaders, not gunmen, ordinary people. The dead would later be counted, 564 killed over about 10 days. Of those, more than 500 were civilians. The forensic evidence told the story the official reports would not. In 6 of every 10 cases, the victims had been shot in the head. Of the firearm victims examined, the overwhelming majority were shot from a distance. They were not deaths from confrontations. They were executions. And the profile of the dead was always the same: young, poor, mostly black or brown men, most of them with no criminal record at all. One of them was Edson Rogério Silva dos Santos. He was 29 years old. He collected garbage in the coastal city of Santos. He had just had surgery on his mouth and was recovering at home. On the night of the 15th of May, he went out to get medicine. He was shot 5 times. His mother was named Debra Maria da Silva. And out of her grief, she built a movement of mothers whose sons were killed in those days. The Mães de Maio, the Mothers of May. They are still asking, 20 years later, who killed their children. No one has answered. The investigations into the more than 500 deaths were never completed. Edson was not the worst of it, because there is no worst of it. In Santos, a woman 9 months pregnant was shot in the head and in the belly by 4 hooded men. The dead in those streets had names and addresses, and almost none of them had anything to do with the war that was supposedly being fought over them. Remember the dead of Carandiru, the hands raised in front of the faces, the backs turned. 14 years later, in the same state, the bodies in the streets were found the same way, hands over faces, crouched, frozen in the posture of people who knew exactly what was coming. And the attacks themselves ended not with a police victory, but with a conversation. The government sent people to speak with Marcola. Within 48 hours of that conversation, the attacks stopped. A prosecutor would call it reckless. The moment you recognize a criminal as your interlocutor, you have made him legitimate. The state had just negotiated with the thing it built. A few weeks later, Marcola was brought before a congressional commission. The deputies tried to lecture him. He did not flinch. And what does a congressman do, he asked them. Don't they steal too? What moral authority does any of you have to shout in my face? One of them answered that every honest man has the right to speak. Marcola replied, "Where is the honest man? Every criminal says he is an honest man." They had come to interrogate him. He left, having interrogated them. After 2006, the PCC stopped trying to shake the country and started trying to own a market. Around 2010, its leadership, still behind bars, began debating a plan they called Project Paraguay. The logic was the logic of any corporation. Cut out the middleman. Stop buying cocaine from independent smugglers and control the pipeline itself. From the coca fields of Bolivia and Paraguay to the docks of Santos, the busiest port in Latin America, and from there across the ocean to Europe. To take the border, they took out the man who owned it. On June 10th, 2016, in the Paraguayan city of Pedro Juan Caballero, a drug lord called the King of the Border was driving his armored Hummer when a vehicle blocked the road and a .50 caliber machine gun opened fire through a custom port. The bullets, nearly 14 centimeters long, went through the armored glass. He was hit at least 16 times. Police recovered 200 shell casings. The PCC took the route, and it broke a truce. For nearly 20 years, it had kept an uneasy peace with the other great Brazilian faction, the Comando Vermelho, the Red Command, born in a Rio de Janeiro prison in the 1970s. After the border killing, that peace collapsed, and the two factions went to war across the entire country. You could see the war in the prisons. On New Year's Day, 2017, in Manaus, 56 inmates were killed in a single 17-hour riot. They were decapitated, burned, and thrown over the walls. Days later, in Roraima, 33 more were killed. It was the worst prison killing since Carandiru itself. And still, the organization grew. Today, by the estimates of Brazilian prosecutors, the PCC has around 40,000 baptized members and a network of some 100,000 people. If it were a company, it would be among the largest employers in Brazil. It operates in every Brazilian state and in more than 24 countries. It partners with the Calabrian Mafia, the Ndrangheta, to move cocaine through the port of Santos and on into Europe. And its money no longer hides under mattresses. In recent investigations, Brazilian authorities found the faction laundering tens of billions through a chain of roughly 1,000 gas stations and through investment funds and fintechs, some operating on Faria Lima Avenue, the Wall Street of Sao Paulo. One estimate of its annual revenue from just two sectors, drugs and fuel, runs past 100 billion reais. The boy who sniffed glue had built a holding company. And on the very morning the United States moved against it, Brazilian prosecutors were raiding a fresh set of fintechs that had moved billions more, the faction having simply rebuilt the laundering machine the last operation tore down. It was born preaching peace, justice, and liberty against the oppressors. It became one of them. On the 28th of May, 2026, the Secretary of State of the United States signed a document placing the Primeiro Comando da Capital and the Comando Vermelho beside it, on the same list as the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, foreign terrorist organizations. Effective the 5th of June, Brazil rejected it within a day. Its government argued that these are not terrorists in the true sense, that they kill for profit, for cocaine and weapons, not for an ideology or a god. They are, the argument went, the most dangerous kind of business. Both things can be true, and neither one touches the oldest fact in this story. The PCC was not born in Paraguay, or at the port of Santos, or on Faria Lima. It was born on a prison yard, out of a promise about 111 men who were shot to death by the state on the 2nd of October, 1992, and for whom no one was ever punished. The system that created the conditions for the PCC is the same system that in May of 2006 killed 500 more in the dark and never answered for them either. Deborah Maria da Silva is still waiting for that answer. So, are the mothers who stood beside her, the man who built the empire that grew out of all of it, sits in an isolation cell in Brasilia, where his own family says he has begun to lose his grip on what is real. And the organization he built is bigger than it has ever been. The state has tried to crush it for more than 30 years. Every time, it has come back larger, because every massacre, every transfer, every cell only proved the thing the 8 men wrote on the yard in 1993. The United States can call it terrorism. Brazil can call it organized crime. Inside the prisons where it began, the men use a simpler word. They call it the party. And the party does not lose elections because it does not hold them. It only recruits. Peace, justice, and liberty. They are still selling it. The country is still paying for it. If this story stayed with you, the way these stories tend to, consider subscribing. The next one we tell will almost certainly begin where the official record decided to stop.